Yep, that is
great. Okay, before starting my communication, I would like to thank Karenza Lewis for her invitation and this great European initiative, and Susan Kinby for organizing this virtual meeting and helping me. And please be indulgent with my English, which is not very good. So, spatial planning in France is currently accompanied by archaeological monitoring. This was not always the case. The destruction of Middle Ages rural settlements was indeed numerous until the 1990s. They concerned both deserted villages as well as villages that were currently inhabited. Slide, please. Before showing, yes, thank you. Before showing you how spatial planning ultimately turned out to be extremely positive for the development of our knowledge of the early Middle Ages settlement habitat in France, I will develop in 2 points a quick story of this a priori contradictory relationship. In the first part, I will discuss the current issues with regard to the evolution of the development. It was mainly in the 1990s that the next slide, please, preventive archaeology developed in France in connection with major development infrastructures such as motorways, railways, next slide, please, stations, airports, business parks, housing estates, or in connection with raw material extracting rocks, mainly gravel pits. The common characteristic of these developments are they cover large areas of more than 1 hectare and are located outside any built-up area, town or village in the countryside. Thanks to the emergence and consolidation of legislation that led in 2001 a law on preventive archaeology. The next slide, please. Each land development project involving a layered surface area leads to the carrying out of a genesis, and then, if remains are discovered, to excavations. These measures have had a considerable impact on our knowledge of the early Middle Ages settlement in France. Indeed, before the mid-1980s, the few known settlement sites, Brébières in the North France, Monville in Normandy, and a few others in Alsace and Burgundy, were excavated over a few hundred square meters. The nature of the remains and their short chronological lifespan led to a miserable view of early medieval settlements. These developments of the territory firstly lead to an important change of scale. Next slide, please, which leads to the exploration of sites over, next slide, over large areas. These excavations have led to the discovery of remains which were then little or not known, such as wooden post buildings, silos, ovens, wells, and so on. They also make it possible to understand the spatial organization of these different structures, and sometimes they are linked, next slide please, with entities such as the church and the cemetery. This change of scale is also at the origin of the study of landscape installations, paths, ditches, enclosures, and so on, but unfortunately not of the field, unlike in other European countries such as Spain, Great Britain, or Denmark. Secondly, these developments are at the origin of an unprecedented increase in the number of excavated sites, leading to a doubling of the number of non-early medieval settlement sites between 1990 and 2000, and a tripling between 2000 and 2020. Finally, this development of excavations has been accompanied by the development, next slide please, development of paleo-environmental studies, geomorphology, archaeology, carpology, palynology, and so on. Thus opening up a well-filled knowledge previously unknown on the dynamics of landscapes and their exploitations. The increase in the corpus also makes it possible for the first time to draw comparisons between regions and to identify regional specialties. Nevertheless, it's important to bear in mind that these territorial developments or major works are unevenly distributed throughout France, and that from the mid-1980s to the mid-1990s, they mainly concern the Île-de-France, the region around Paris, and the north of the French regions, and to a lesser extent, Lorraine, Eastern France, and the Rhône-Alpes regions. It was only gradually that other regions benefited from these major developments, such as Western and Central France, Franche-Comté, and Auvergne region. Recently, these infrastructures have particularly affected the south of France. Next slide, please. Thanks. These irregularities in the development of the territory remain a constant in preventive archaeology, and this is as therefore reflected in the renewal of knowledge of medieval habitats in the French regions. In parallel with these major developments, other types of work have also contributed to improving our knowledge of the early Middle Ages rural settlements. It's from the 2000s onwards that the nature and location of developments began to change. We are witnessing an increase in the number of work within the current villages, again leading to a change in scale. These works affect much smaller areas: renovation of the church square, construction of municipal buildings, modifications of networks, or compliance with safety and accessibility standards. Next slide, please. Yes. In the example of Bréal in Britain that you have before you, the surface area of the excavation is 250 square meters. From 2012 onwards, the phenomenon is accentuated by the increase in archaeological zoning. Next slide, please, which allow for finer monitoring of development permits. The data collected is generally more incomplete insofar as the observations often stop at the level of the surveys. Even if they are positive, there are two possibilities. First, the state service prescribes an excavation, but the developer cannot finance it. The plots are frozen. Two, the state service does not order an excavation. The remains are destroyed without any further observations beyond those made during the diagnosis. The nature of the data differs slightly, with more religious buildings and funerary areas. The excavations generated by these works have made many contributions, have allowed a new rural a new view of rural settlements to be taken, different from that taken in the 1980s. I'm sorry. Oh, I'm lost. Oh. Okay. I'm sorry. Different from the taken in the 1980s and the 1990s. Nevertheless, until the last few years, they have led to analyses mainly based on the exploration of deserted villages. These contributions can be presented according to two approaches. Several elements show that, contrary to the accepted idea of a countryside that is not subject to much change, the early Middle Ages rural worlds were dynamic. One of the contributions concerns the chronology of the sites, which has benefited from the parallel development of ceramic studies, thanks in particular to preventive archaeological excavations in urban areas. It has thus been possible to identify, please, the next slide. Thanks. To identify three periods of development of the early Middle Ages rural settlement, which are distinct from the traditional historical period. I don't go into further detail. The table before you summarizes the main contributions. It should be noted, for example, next slide, please, that the number of abandoned settlements around the year 1000 is not massive as assumed. Moreover, whatever the period, creation, continuity of occupations, and abandonment punctuate the early Middle Ages rural settlement with regional variations. Another contribution is the recognition not of an unstable habitat as described by some historians, but of settlements that transform and adapts according to land modifications, change in land management and exploitation, technical improvement, and political change. Next slide, please. An example for this emergence of strip plot and the 3-year rotation in Eastern France. I'm sorry for the wrong scribes on the slide. Another contribution is that of the evidence of a varied rural habitat. Next slide, please. It was possible to distinguish between the following types of settlement: isolated, dispersed, loosely grouped, and grouped or neglected. You have before you the definition to which these types relate. Within these different types, archaeologists have gradually learned to identify settlements that are described as allied. Next slide, please. That don't fit in the same way according to their dating. These are different from the modes. More and more funerary and or religious buildings are being identified, whether or not they are associated with funerary complexes. It's possible after about 40 years to distinguish geographical areas in Gaul according to the way in which the settlements are constituted. The distinction between northern and southern Gaul was already known. Next slide, please. On the other hand, the distinction between the eastern 2/3 of Gaul and the western 1/3 gradually emerged as a result of the infrastructure development affecting Western France. In fact, in Western Gaul, next slide, please, the settlements are generally inserted into a plot of lands strongly marked by ditches and sometimes installed in enclosures. unlike the eastern two-thirds of Gaul, where the settlements are generally open. Conversely, the use of the second feature buildings does not extend to Western Gaul and so on. The more recent investigations within the villages currently inhabited are allowed the acquisition of new data, showing in particular examples of settlements that have survived, for some of them to the present day. The current problematic of the study of early medieval settlements, obviously enriched by all the previous achievements, focuses on 3 points, some of which are not particularly new. What has changed is that archaeologists are now able to deal with them without being influenced by traditional historical patterns, thanks in particular to the increase in data, mainly from preventive archaeological excavations in village settings. The first point is to understand the evolution of the importance of the place of worship within the settlements. Next slide, please. The data reconciliation from excavations in both present-day villages and deserted villages in the early Middle Ages shows that the religious or funerary buildings were present in the countryside in the region north of the Loire from the middle of the 7th century, and that their number increased in the Carolingian period. These buildings were built of wood or stone. It is now necessary to understand the topographical dynamics that gradually led to the place of worship being placed in the center, or at least in the village space, and to understand the phenomenon of the transformation of private churches into buildings dependent solely on the ecclesiastical institution. The second point concerns burial spaces. Traditionally, the cemetery near the church was considered a stable space throughout the Middle Ages. The development of excavations in village settings has shown that this was not the case, and that there could be several burial complexes within the same village. Next slide, please. And that this could be contemporary or succeed one another. The last point leads to a change in the scale of the analysis. Indeed, certain territories, due to their particular situation, have experienced a large number of excavations in relation to developments. It's now necessary to bring together all the information from excavations in village or rural areas in an attempt to understand the dynamics that preside over the future of the different settlements discovered, and to analyze the factors that allowed one or more to survive beyond the 12th century. Next slide, please. The church research program is currently underway in the village of Tremblay, France, near the Roissy airport, where archaeological observations began in the 1970s. To provisionally concluding this rapid examination of the link between spatial planning and rural housing in France, I will say that the impact is extremely positive on our knowledge. Progress has indeed been very quick. It should nevertheless be emphasized that the quality of the excavations is not entirely satisfactory, insofar as the sites are very rarely fully excavated, and they too often take the form of a highway or a rail line. The methods...
Edith, you've got about 4 or 5 minutes.
Yes, thank you. The methods put in place to ensure the optimization of excavations at a lower cost lead to dispensing with information like lack of paleo-environmental studies in the village environment, excavation by half of the structures, use of geophysics to the detriment of excavations, and so on. See, not to excavate the structures and to only take a survey of the remains that appear following the stripping. Next slide, please. This is the case, for example, of the Meold site, for which a restitution was nevertheless made. Furthermore, these developments also tend to erase the ancient architectural frameworks which are sometimes still present in the village currently inhabited. Nevertheless, without these developments, which in the end are simply part of a story of the settlement, the study of the ancient romance would not be possible, at least on a scale compatible with data acquisition. The contribution of these excavations goes beyond simply renewing our knowledge of the medieval settlements. It allows current projects to be reinvented and their inhabitants and their councillors to appropriate the very notion of land use planning. Next slide, please. Thank you for your attention.